It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome to another podcast by George. Well, I promoted this show a little bit by calling it Morel Mania, and unless you're from the heartland, you may not know what I'm talking about. It's a mania. It's a fever. It's almost cult this time of year. I mean, these Morels are something else. For people that love them and hunt them, they wait all year for this season, and we're in the midst of it. I started finding Morels about a week or so ago, and they're rounding into form here in the state of Iowa. They moved from the southern part of the United States north. Of course, the Morels don't, but the weather does, and that's what enables you to be able to find it. And I've got a couple of things here to kind of set the stage I want to show right away. The first thing is, particularly for people around the country, although Morels can be found in all 50 states, a lot of folks maybe have never seen one, they've never hunted them. This little video is from my phone, and it shows you how to find one. I mean, it shows you how visible they are from a distance. And so take a look at this now, and you'll see. Watch the video, and I reach in, and I get it. So you can see before the undergrowth gets too high, if you're paying attention, if you're looking, they're not that hard to find. I mean, it isn't the being able to see them part that's the tough part, although it's a challenge. It's just finding where they're at. It's all about timing, and it's all about location. And for me, the timing kind of goes along with like when the dandelions first start to appear, or when the lilac bushes go into bloom, or the crabapple trees. That's when you better start looking for Morels. Now this other one is a photo, again, that I took with my, this is from my phone. And this is the bad boy. This is the big one. This is the big Morel that I got a couple of years ago. And it, the focal point on the lens of the camera maybe makes it look a little bigger than it actually was. But you can see my hand there, and you can see that that's a big Morel. And that leads me to my story with Morels. I retired a couple of years ago, and I thought, okay, I'm going to make a real I'm going to try this time. I'm going to go out and I'm going to scout and I'm going to find these things. Well, a couple of years ago, man, I found the place. I mean, I was bringing grocery sacks full of Morels out of the woods. I was the Morel maven. I thought, my God, I finally found it in retirement. I finally found something that I'm good at, something that I'm going to be known for. I'm going to be the Morel maven. I'm going to provide these to friends and family members. I even got a buddy at a restaurant that I gave some to. It was great. So I got ready for the next year. The next year, we had one of those 100-year floods that comes along about once every 5 years, it seems like now. My happy hunting ground was located near a river. The river went out of its banks. It flooded everything several feet deep, probably. And it left behind probably a foot of what I call sludge, or slag, maybe you could call it. Just the river bottom, hard mud that caked the forest floor. I went back last year, nothing. I went back this year, nothing. So I went from being the big man on campus with Morels to totally skunked. I got nothing but pictures and videos to show. Although this year I did find a few. And I wanted to check in with our good friend, a friend of the podcast by George that was on last year from Iowa State University, to kind of get her take and her advisory when it comes to Morels. And it's Dr. Lena Rodriguez Salamanca. Now, am I saying that, Doctor? Am I saying that right?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Rodriguez Salamanca.
Yeah, my pronunciations are not too good sometimes. Now, she's a diagnostician, an extension plant pathologist with the Iowa State University Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic. She's a member of the National Plant Diagnostic Network. She's a specialist in plant pathology, diagnostics, plant diseases, and what they call mycology. She got her master's at Michigan State and also her PhD at Michigan State University. And she also teaches Morel mushroom certification. You need one of those if you're going to try to retail or sell them, or if you think you want to make it a part of your life, then she's the one that you go to. And I'm still in the hobbyist category, and I'm hoping for a return to better times. But this year is going to be in the probably fair to middling category for me. Well, welcome on in here, Doctor, and what do you hear this year? What's your take on this season compared to past years?
Well, I think that they're starting to pop up. I do follow all the social media groups across Iowa that would. There's a lot of people posting photos, and there's a group administrator in Facebook, a couple of them that would actually make maps of where there's sightings. So it's pretty cool. And so I see that, this weekend people were starting to post some photos of morels. They were smaller than normally they would get. Myself, I've been finding more of the half-free morel. Just today I found some, but I think we're up to a good start.
Yeah, I was out looking today. I didn't have any luck, unfortunately. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's one place I know where I can find some. Those are for my wife mostly. Yeah, just for her. Not a lot, but I'm trying to find another, place where I can have a lot of success, and that hasn't happened yet. That's where I was today. And I was thinking about you. Now, I'm walking along, and I'm looking, kind of trying to think about where a likely place might be. But I thought, what would somebody like Dr. Salamanca, what do you think as you're walking along? What's your mind's eye seeing, and what are you looking for?
Well, I'm looking for an area that looks like where the soil feels moist, but not saturated. Areas where there would be elms, ashes, and areas where there is a lot of shade. Are very conducive for the type of morel proliferation. To me, the experience of walking in the woods, it's just such a great, your focus on the ground, and the morel sometimes can blend with the leaves from the fall. So having a little stick and kind of moving around those leaves very carefully. And in my experience, once you have spotted one, then you stop and look around because they're all around there in a radius.
That's when you find a few, when you find some. Now, when you're in a place, and I liken it to bass fishing. I used to do some bass fishing. You go to places, great habitat as they call it. Beautiful lake, beautiful day, conditions absolutely perfect. You think, and you got all the equipment and the fishing lures and all that, and you think, my God, this is it. If there's ever going to be bass here, this is the day. Nothing. And there's never any explanation. So I was thinking of you again. What do you think when you don't find any in a place, and maybe you go to the same place several years and there's just nothing there? How do you account for that? What happened so that morels would be barren basically in that area? What separates a place like that from a place where they are found?
Well, if you're hunting in a public space, you may be sharing the space, and someone may have come already. Also, you're competing with the wildlife that will come and pick it up. So occasions like you're saying, if there was flooding and the colony was disrupted enough that, those carotia, those dormant stages of the morels, the way that they overwinter may have been moved by the water. And so they're not there anymore, like I'm suspected happened on your spot.
Yeah.
So it really depends. Once a site becomes depleted of nutrients, then naturally the fungi, those mushrooms are gonna use those spores that they produce to start looking for other places. And so just like a dandelion, the wind comes and they're forcibly discharged, and if the wind picks them up, they'll just go. Those spores will go and find a new spot.
Yeah, and I know you've studied this, the science of mushrooms and morels extensively. But okay, so I think of it this way: I'm walking along, and I always think about the Native Americans. Early man, the first people to walk along and find mushrooms, for instance. Well, okay, if they picked them up off of the forest floor and ate them, they got sick. They might have died, maybe. But somebody engineered or thought of picking them and cooking them, maybe with the advent of fire when that came along or whatever. And when they're fried or cooked, they're quite tasty. They're completely edible. I don't know how nutritious they are, but they're fine. How do you think that process worked? How did it go from something that you could pick and it could kill you to a delicacy that is enjoyed in American homes, across the heartland?
That's a really good question. I wish I had a time machine. I think it makes a lot of sense that the nutrients on the morels become more available to us after they've been cooked and gone through heat. The cell wall of mushrooms and morels is made out of chitin, and so chitin is also the type of chemical that insects will have on some other cells. So it's really hard stuff. So once you cook it and put heat through it, then it starts breaking down, and it helps us digest it better, the same way that we do with any other foods that we do have to cook that way. With that said, it's always important to remember to cook them thoroughly because they're hard to digest otherwise. And even though we know that morels are excellent for raiding and we don't have any evidence that they produce any toxins, if you're a first-time hunter or you're going to try morels for the first time, be very careful, eat very small amounts, cook them thoroughly, do not mix them with alcohol, and take it easy because this may not be for you.
Oh, that's well. So, honest to God, I'm not crazy about them. I just know people that are, including my wife, and I mean, it's like they're just wild about them. And so, I really enjoy finding the things and passing them along. I mean, it's really a great gift for folks. What do you think about the idea of picking it, pulling it up by its roots, a morel, as opposed to pinching it off at the stem? Is there any science to that?
Well, I always have heard from mycologists in general and from food safety experts, it's a good idea to harvest above the soil level. You can pinch if your hands are clean, your fingers are clean. You can use a knife and make sure that knife is being cleaned often too. That way you minimize any contamination that may come from the soil. The soil is a very rich environment, lots of other fungi, bacteria, etc. that if it jumps into your precious cargo, you may end up with decay. This could happen in transit, especially if you take your morels on plastic bags or containers that will be very conducive to humidity. And so the morels can start decaying. So even that's one of those reasons where if you maybe end up ingesting, even though you cooked it, but it was starting to decay, you may come into some problems and become more had a stomach upset and so forth.
Yeah, stay away from that. Well, I guess, and you touched on this a little bit, and one of the reasons I really wanted to make sure I got this into the podcast rotation this year is because people got some extra time on their hands right now. People are going outside. People are wanting to social distance. Well, all of those things are perfect for mushroom hunting. I mean, you kind of want to be out there by yourself. You don't want to give up your secrets to anybody. And obviously, it's outside, and it takes time. I mean, you unless you are lucky or you really have a hot spot, you're not just going to wander out there and find some right away. So if you got a few hours and you're looking for something to do, this is a great thing. And there's that element of health involved in it too. Now, I do this podcast for Above and Beyond Cancer, and every now and then they talk about the mental and physical benefits of what's called forest bathing. It's actually a science that was kind of technically discovered back in the 1980s, I think, in Japan. And they've been able to empirically prove that this is good for the mind and it's good for the body to get out there and get in the flora and the fauna and finding these mushrooms. Like you said, even if you don't find any, it's going to be it's a win-win because it's good for you from that perspective.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's actually, the hunt is kind of what keeps you engaged, but being there, enjoying that moment, looking at the trees, enjoying, like today when I was out, there was a couple deer. I mean, it's so beautiful. Just being there is part of the experience. And yes, I think it helps with mental health and health in general, and especially in this difficult times where we have to, experience isolation. This is a good activity that you can practice, still keeping social distancing in mind.
Well, that's great. That's well said. One serious thing I did want to ask you about is, and we talk about this a lot on the podcast, climate crisis, what some of the climate scientists now are calling climate catastrophe. Are you hearing about, or are you seeing any ill effects of climate change when it comes to morels and mushrooms?
I don't think for morels in general. I think what came first to mind was that there are now mushrooms that are not native to our forests that were cultivated, and they're so prolific that they kind of escape cultivation, and now we find those in our forests, and they can be very prolific. And so every time that we have such invasive species, there's a competition for resources, there's a competition for nutrients and space. And so I don't know that it's necessarily related with the weather, but there is that seasonality of the mushrooms that if we see snow later, later, knock on wood, hopefully we won't, but that definitely will disrupt the life cycle of mushrooms like morels if the temperatures are kind of too off the charts.
Well, yeah, and that has to do with climate change also. I mean, it sounds crazy. I mean, we're recording this the last day of April, but here a few years ago, it snowed in May and snowed several inches. I mean, believe it or not, I mean, and I told people at the time, my God, if that isn't evidence of climate change, I don't know what is. It doesn't snow in this part of the country in May, folks, but it did 4 or 5 years ago. Well, that's great. Again, thanks for coming on the podcast, for sharing your insight and expertise. I'm going to give you the last word here. Just maybe a couple of reminders for folks, or something that you always like to touch upon when you're talking about the magic morels.
Yeah, practice good judgment. If you're not sure what it is, don't eat it, don't pick it. Good identification is crucial. Wash your hands, transport your morels properly, keep them cool, inspect them so that they don't have any signs of decay or rot. And if this is your first year trying it, be very careful and make some friends. There's a lot of people that go out, and you can learn a lot from other folks. That's how I learned about morels. I hunted morels for the first time here in Iowa with a good friend of mine, and that's how I learned.
That's great. Well, that's good advice. I'm going to put up another picture here, just to remind folks of what they look like. Now, this is a mess of mushrooms, I guess you would call it, a bunch that I was able to gather again from that hot spot, that honey hole as they call it, a couple of years ago. You see, they're very distinct in their appearance. I mean, there's nothing that looks quite like them. If they don't look like this, they can be different in coloration, but they all pretty much look exactly like this. This is what you're looking for, and this is what you want to pick. Well, that's great. That's going to wrap it up. That's Morel Magic, Morel Mania for 2020. And joining us on the Podcast by George live line graciously again this year, a friend of the podcast, Dr. Lena Rodriguez Salamanca, a diagnostician and extension plant pathologist with the Iowa State University Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic, a member of the National Plant Diagnostic Network. And if you want to know more about morels and maybe getting a certification and maybe sell these things, or go into a little cottage business, or you're really good at it, I hope you're better at it than I am, she's your contact. She's the person to talk to. That's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's another podcast by George.